I'll never forget that Thanksgiving dinner. We were all at the table, my parents, my older brother, my grandma, and me, laughing and enjoying the night. It was freezing outside, and the windows were fogged up from the heat of the kitchen. That's when we noticed something strange, a shadow moving near the gate. My dad was the first to point it out and said something like, "Is that a neighbor needing help?" We all turned to look, and there he was, a man standing on the sidewalk, wearing a worn-out jacket and holding a phone with the flashlight on. He looked disoriented, staring straight at our house. My mom, always the kind one, suggested we should help. "Go see what he needs," she told my dad. My brother and I stayed by the window, watching as my dad opened the door and started talking to the guy. We couldn't hear the conversation, but we could see the man waving his hands a lot and pointing toward a car parked further down the street. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went out to check. That's when I started feeling uneasy. There was something off about the way the man looked at our house, like he was analyzing more than just the help he claimed to need. My dad walked with the man toward the car while my brother and I kept watching from the window. From where we stood, we could see them stop near an old sedan with the headlights off. The man was gesturing wildly, pointing at the hood, but my dad looked hesitant. He kept a bit of distance, almost like he sensed something wasn't right too. After a few minutes, my dad stepped back and began walking home, probably realizing there wasn't much he could do. That's when things got really weird. The man, instead of focusing on the car, started following him back, getting closer with each step. By the time my dad reached the porch, he shut the gate quickly, but the man stayed on the sidewalk, just staring at our front door. My dad came inside, and I could tell by his expression that he knew this wasn't just some guy with car trouble. Before he could even close the door, the man started shouting, saying he needed to come in to use the phone. He sounded desperate, but there was something in his eyes, something calculated, that didn't match his tone. My brother jumped up and locked the door right away, but the man didn't stop. He started banging on the door, hard, yelling things like, "You can't just leave me out here." The banging on the door echoed through the house, and the whole Thanksgiving vibe disappeared in seconds. My mom was panicking and grabbed her phone, heading down the hallway to call the police, while my grandma sat there confused, trying to figure out what was going on. My dad and brother stayed in the living room, moving furniture to block the door, just in case. The man outside was getting louder and more aggressive. He started pounding the door with his fists, shouting things that made no sense. A mix of begging for help and throwing out threats. I stood frozen on the stairs, unsure of what to do, my heart racing as I tried to process how fast everything had gone downhill. After a while, the banging stopped, but we could hear him walking around on the porch. The sound of his boots scraping against the wooden deck was terrifying. He was testing the windows, tugging at the handles to see if any were unlocked. My dad whispered for everyone to stay away from the windows, so I hid behind the couch with my grandma. My brother stood by one of the windows, keeping an eye on the man. That's when we heard it, the sound of glass breaking. One of the side windows in the living room had been hit, and now the man was trying to reach inside to unlock it. My dad yelled at him to stop and slammed a piece of wood against the window frame, trying to scare him off. For a moment, it worked, but then the guy started laughing. This eerie, unsettling laugh, like he was enjoying our fear. Finally, we heard sirens in the distance. That sound brought a small wave of relief, but it also made us realize just how vulnerable we were. The man stopped messing with the window and stepped back, staring at the house like he was weighing his options. Then, out of nowhere, he bolted toward the gate, probably trying to escape before the cops arrived. As the patrol car pulled up in front of our house, 2 officers jumped out and shouted for him to stop. He hesitated for a second, but didn't get far before they surrounded him. My dad stepped outside to talk to the police, while my mom stayed inside, still clutching the phone with shaky hands. When they finally cuffed him, we got a closer look, and it was even scarier. The guy had this blank, soulless stare, like he wasn't really all there. My dad explained what had happened, and the officers told us he was already wanted for doing the same thing to other families in the area. He'd been pretending to need help with his car, tricking people into letting him close enough to strike. The part that gave me chills was when they searched him and found a knife in his pocket, something we wouldn't have known if the police hadn't shown up in time. I visited my grandparents last Thanksgiving. They live in an old house out in the countryside, surrounded by open fields and almost no neighbors. It's the kind of place that feels frozen in time, with creaky floors and a constant smell of aged wood. I arrived in the late afternoon, and we spent the evening in the kitchen, cooking dinner and sharing old family stories. I've always loved how cozy their home feels, but that night, something felt off. Just as we put dessert in the oven, a low noise came from the basement, like something heavy being dragged. My grandparents exchanged a quick glance, but just smiled and said it was the old house complaining about the cold. The sound came back a few times during the evening, and each time it was harder to ignore. It was subtle but specific, like faint footsteps or something scraping against the concrete floor. I asked my grandparents about it again, but they brushed it off and changed the subject. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I knew that basement had been locked for years, filled with old family stuff no one wanted to touch. Around 10 p.m., I went up to the guest room. I tried to sleep, but the creaks and noises from the basement kept bothering me, getting clearer each time. That's when I decided I'd check it out the next day, just to ease my mind. The next morning, while my grandparents were busy making breakfast and chatting about the day's plans, I quietly grabbed the basement key from the hook in the kitchen. I pretended I was going for a walk around the property but headed straight for the basement door. As soon as I opened it, the smell of mildew and dust hit me, and the dim light on the wooden staircase made me pause for a second. My heart was racing as I took each step down. Every creak of the stairs sounded way too loud in the silence. When I got to the bottom, I saw the shelves stacked with old boxes and furniture covered in sheets, just as I remembered. But something felt wrong. There were fresh marks on the concrete floor, like something heavy had been dragged. As I looked around more, I found something that made my stomach drop: a pile of blankets and a few empty food cans hidden behind an old cabinet. There were also neatly folded clothes on a worn-out chair and a flashlight that looked almost new. All of it was recent. It couldn't have been part of the family's old junk. Someone had been living down there in my grandparents' basement, and it hadn't been long since they'd left. The thought that this person might have been listening to us talk the night before, or worse, moving around the house while we were sleeping, made my heart pound. I climbed back up the stairs as quickly and quietly as I could, my legs shaking the whole way. Back in the kitchen, I hung the key back where it was and tried to act normal, but my grandpa quickly noticed something was off. He asked if I was feeling okay, and I just mumbled something about needing fresh air. I stepped outside and tried to gather my thoughts. My mind was racing. Who could have been living down there? How were they getting in and out without anyone noticing? And, most terrifying of all, were they still here? I didn't have the courage to tell my grandparents right away. I didn't want to scare them without knowing more. So, I made a plan. That night, when everyone was asleep, I'd stay up and listen for any sounds coming from the basement. That evening, I tried to keep things normal during dinner. My grandparents were relaxed, talking about family stories and making plans for Christmas, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise in the house felt amplified. After they went to bed, I stayed in the living room, lights off, with a blanket wrapped around me, waiting. It didn't take long before the noises started again. At first, it was just a faint creak, but then it sounded like soft footsteps. The sound was coming from the hallway near the basement door. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like whoever was there could hear it. I didn't know whether to grab my phone, call the police, or confront whoever it was. I decided to grab my phone, but in my panic, I dropped it on the floor. The loud thud echoed through the quiet house. For a moment, the noises stopped. My entire body froze, like I had become part of the couch I was sitting on. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps slowly climbing the basement stairs. They weren't rushed or sneaky, but deliberate and steady, like the person knew exactly where they were going. The doorknob to the hallway turned slowly, and I could barely breathe as I stared at it, waiting for the worst to happen. But strangely, the door didn't open. Instead, the footsteps stopped and everything went silent again. I ran straight to my grandparents' room and knocked until they woke up. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out in a jumbled mess. My grandpa grabbed a flashlight and went straight to the basement door, while my grandma stayed with me in the kitchen. We stood there, listening as he walked down the stairs. A few minutes later, he came back, looking pale, and said there was no one down there. But he noticed the door leading outside from the basement was unlocked. He locked it again and reassured us it was probably just a homeless person who had already left. I couldn't sleep at all that night. All I could think about was how many times that person might have been inside the house, maybe even while my grandparents were asleep. Early the next morning, as soon as the sun was up, I asked my grandpa to check the basement again. This time, I insisted on going with him. We went down together and started searching every corner, using the flashlight to light up the dark spaces. That's when we found it. Behind a stack of old boxes, there was a hole in the wall, covered by a poorly fitted wooden board. It led directly outside to the field behind the house. My grandpa was stunned. He had no idea how it got there. It was obvious that whoever had been living there was using that hole to come and go unnoticed. Even after we sealed the hole and reinforced the locks, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Before I left, I begged my grandparents to call the police, but they didn't want to get the authorities involved. To them, the intruder was gone and probably wouldn't come back. But for me, the thought of someone living in the basement, moving freely around the house while we were there, still gives me chills. Whenever I think about it, I remember the noises we heard that first night and wonder what could have happened if I hadn't woken up, or worse, if I had decided to go down to the basement alone. My grandparents still call it a scare and nothing more, but I've never looked at their house the same way again. I wasn't looking forward to Thanksgiving that year. It was my first one since the divorce, and being alone seemed like the best way to avoid awkward family questions. My new house was in a small, quiet town, perfect for a fresh start. I spent the day trying to stay busy, cooked something simple, unpacked a few boxes still scattered in the living room, and ended the night with a glass of wine. Outside, the cold was intense, but I felt cozy in my little safe haven, until I noticed something strange. The porch lights were on, even though I hadn't turned them on. At first, I thought it might be an electrical issue. The house was old, and despite some renovations, it wasn't perfect. I walked to the front door, flipped the switch off, and went back to the couch. I had barely sat down when the lights came back on again. This time, I heard a faint creaking sound from the porch. I got up to check, but when I peeked out the window, the street was completely empty, lit only by a few distant streetlights. I convinced myself it was just the wind or a wiring problem, but deep down, I couldn't shake a growing unease. Around 10 p.m., after another failed attempt to turn off the lights, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Wet footprints on the porch, near the front door. They definitely weren't there before. I froze, staring at those marks, trying to come up with a logical explanation. It hadn't rained, and no one should have been out there. I told myself they were old marks that just looked fresh in the porch light, but something about how perfect and recent they looked made my skin crawl. Then I heard it, a soft tapping sound, barely audible, coming from the back kitchen window. My heart started racing. I couldn't move for a few seconds, but I finally forced myself to go check. By the time I got there, the tapping had stopped. I peered out the window, but all I could see was my own reflection in the glass. The darkness outside felt thicker, more threatening. I locked every door and window on my way back to the living room, my gut screaming that something was seriously wrong. I sat on the couch, trying to figure out what to do. Calling the cops felt like overreacting, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then it happened again, the noise. This time, it came from another window, down the hallway. It was the same soft, deliberate tapping, almost like whoever was doing it wanted me to know they were there. My whole body went into panic mode, every sound in the house suddenly louder than it should be. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but my hand froze before hitting call. What if it was just an animal? What if I ended up looking ridiculous? And then I heard something that erased all doubts. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the back porch. They weren't hurried. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking without a care in the world. I ran back to the kitchen, keeping the lights off so I wouldn't be seen, and peeked through the curtain. There was no one there. No shadows, no movement. But the footprints, fresh, wet ones, were there again, right where I knew they hadn't been a moment ago. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. It felt like I was being hunted, watched by someone I couldn't see. I locked the back door as tightly as I could and bolted to my bedroom, grabbing a kitchen knife on the way. I locked myself inside and sat on the floor with my back against the bed, trying to hear any sounds that would tell me where they were. Every creak of the house felt magnified. Every little noise made my heart race. And then, the worst sound of all. The back door handle turning, slowly, followed by a faint push, like someone was testing how much give it had. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands shaking uncontrollably, I finally called 911, whispering to the operator about what was happening. They told me to stay calm and assured me a patrol car was on its way, but it didn't help the fear gripping me. The noises stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow even worse. I sat there, clutching the knife, imagining all the horrible possibilities. Was the person still out there? Were they planning their next move? Time felt frozen, and all I could do was pray the cops would show up before something happened. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the sound of sirens in the distance. It was a moment of relief, but also sheer terror. What if the person was still nearby? When the patrol car's lights lit up my street, I bolted to the bedroom window and waved like a maniac to get their attention. They knocked on the front door, but I couldn't bring myself to open it right away. I waited until they announced themselves before unlocking everything and letting them in. The officers searched the property with flashlights, and one of them asked me to explain what had happened. I was still shaking, barely able to get the words out, but I showed them the footprints and described the noises. After a while, they found more evidence. Wet footprints circling the house and signs that someone had tried to force open the back door. One of the cops said the pattern of the footprints suggested whoever it was had been walking around the house multiple times before trying to break in. Knowing that someone had been watching me, waiting, was the most terrifying realization of all. I always thought I was careful about my home security. I've been living alone for almost 2 years and never had any problems. It was Thanksgiving weekend, and the neighborhood was quieter than usual. Around 8 p.m., my doorbell rang. I went to the door without fully opening it and saw a food delivery guy holding a bag with a well-known company logo. He looked normal, even friendly, but what threw me off was that I hadn't ordered anything. I asked if he was sure about the address, and he glanced quickly at a piece of paper in his hand before saying it must have been a mistake. He apologized, turned around, and walked away. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking it was just a mix-up. Later that night, as I was closing the living room windows, I saw the same delivery guy standing on the sidewalk a few houses down. He was dropping packages off at another house, but instead of leaving after ringing the bell, he just stayed there, waiting. That gave me chills, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe it was some new company policy or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to check through the windows again later to see if he was still around. To my surprise, he was still on the street, leaning against his delivery car and scrolling on his phone. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't stop feeling uneasy. It didn't make sense for him to stay there that long, especially after already passing through the street a few times. I decided to check my security cameras to see what was going on earlier in the day. To my shock, I saw that he had stopped in front of my house earlier that afternoon without ringing the bell. He just stood there for a few minutes, staring at the door, before walking off. I don't know how I didn't notice it before. That feeling of something being wrong got even stronger, but I still tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just lost. The next morning, I woke up with this nagging feeling that something was off. I checked my phone and saw notifications from my security cameras recording motion during the night. When I went through the footage, I was stunned. The same guy had been in my yard at around 3 a.m. He walked up to the door, tilted his head like he was trying to listen to something, and then circled the house. He didn't knock or leave a package. He just observed, almost like he was studying the place. At that point, I knew this wasn't a coincidence, and I had to do something about it. I decided to call the delivery company to report the guy's strange behavior. I explained everything: the doorbell incident, the security footage, and how he kept hanging around my street. After a brief pause, the customer service rep said something that sent chills down my spine. That guy didn't work for them anymore. He'd been fired a few days ago. Apparently, he was still using the uniform and driving a car with outdated company stickers, something they said they couldn't control. The rep apologized but seemed more interested in wrapping up the call than actually helping me. Not knowing what else to do, I went back to my security footage to look for patterns. That's when I noticed he wasn't just delivering packages. He was watching the houses where people opened their doors. He stayed at a distance, almost like he was trying to memorize something. My stomach turned when I realized my house had been one of his targets. Even with the lights off, he came back to my yard that night, getting even closer to the door and testing the handle. At this point, there was no doubt he was planning something worse. By then, I was in full panic mode. I called the police to report what was going on, but to my frustration, they said there wasn't much they could do since he hadn't actually broken in or committed a clear crime. Their advice was to reinforce my security and call back if he showed up again. I hung up feeling exposed and helpless. I spent the rest of the day double-checking locks, testing the alarm, and keeping the outdoor lights on, even during the day. Every little noise outside made my heart race. When night fell, my paranoia was through the roof. I kept all the lights inside on and monitored the cameras obsessively. Around 11 p.m., I heard footsteps on the side of the house where there are no windows, just a low fence. I ran to check the camera feed, and there he was, still in the same uniform, walking slowly through the yard like he was inspecting every detail. Then he moved to the back door and tried to force it open, completely ignoring the fact that there were cameras watching him. I triggered the house alarm manually, and he bolted, disappearing into the darkness. After he ran off, I sat frozen for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I called the police again, and this time, they came to my house. I showed them the security footage, and the officers agreed that it was suspicious, but since he hadn't broken in, they said it would be hard to take action. One of them mentioned it was likely someone using the uniform as a cover to scout houses, but the conversation ended with more advice than solutions. They promised to increase patrols in my area, but I knew once they left, I'd be on my own again. In the days that followed, I stayed on high alert, checking the cameras every time I heard a noise and refusing to open the door for anyone. That man never came back, but the fear lingered. Now, every time I see a delivery driver parked on the street or someone ringing my doorbell, my heart races. I still don't know what he really wanted or how far he was willing to go, but knowing he was lurking around in the middle of the night haunts me to this day. The feeling of being watched, of being analyzed like some kind of target, is something I can't shake off. If you enjoyed the stories, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and leave a like to support our work. Thank you.